Welcome to Mapperton, our family home and estate in Dorset in the southwest of England.
Julie and I took over running Mapperton a few years ago from my parents, the Earl and Countess of Sandwich.
It's a lot of work, but also a lot of fun. This place is full of fascinating stories, extraordinary people, and endless repairs.
So please join our family on this journey of a lifetime as we put all our efforts into preserving this magnificent part of England's heritage.
Welcome to Mapperton in the West Country of England, mentioned in the Domesday Book, and my family's been here only 60 years. How long was the previous family here?
Well, the previous family was here from the 11th century to the 20th century. The names changed, but it was the same family because it went through the female line. So it was the women actually that ran the show at Mapperton. And
we've been the location for several films. Well, we've had Far from the Madding Crowd,
Restoration, Gwyneth Paltrow's Emma, the television series of Tom Jones, recently Rebecca.
And we've been called the nation's finest manor house because of the architecture and the sense of community around us.
Some awards are annual. If you're the nation's finest manor house, you're the nation's finest manor house forever.
Quite right. We know very little about the early history of Mapperton. It was owned by William de Moyen at the time of the Domesday Book. That's back in the 11th century. And it brought him an income of 70 shillings. And then came the Brett family.
Yep, who were cousins of William de Moyen. William de Moyen was kind of William the Conqueror's Gauleiter in the West, the guy who ran the West. And then the Bretts took over. And they had there must have been a medieval house here, of which we have no sure certainty of where it was, but I suspect it was right over there, the other side of the church, because the first reference to any architectural building at Mapperton was the church towards the end of the 13th century, when it was a daughter church of Netherbury, which is a village over the hill there. Actually, all villages are over about 2 or 3 hills in this area. So Netherbury was over there, and this was a daughter church.
And the Bretts were also remembered by the Red Lion.
The Red Lion?
And the Red
Sounds
Lion
like
also appears in the ceilings in the drawing room.
And the Bretts were there until a Brett heiress married Robert Morgan. And Robert Morgan and Mary, his wife, built the 16th century house, probably in the 1540s? 1540s?
Yes.
Yeah. Of which we now have that wing there. And the Brett Red Lion is over the other side, you can't see it, and that is the Morgan Griffin up there on the finial. So this wing is Morgan, 16th century. Then a Morgan heiress married a Richard Brodribb. All male Brodribs were called Richard anyway, there are 5 of them. Richard Brodribb the third, I think it was the third, pulled down the 16th century wing of the of the Morgan house and built this much more fashionable and contemporary hall in the late 17th century, 1670s. And put up, of course, his coat of arms, which is 4 swans between a cross up above the porch. So what you have here so far is 16th century wing, 17th century hall on the foundations of the old 16th century hall, and the church, which was medieval, but was then remodelled, quotes unquotes, by a Richard Brodribb, third Richard Brodribb, in 1603, is it, or 1? Mm-hmm. 3. He then died in 1604, so it was a pious thing to do just before he died. That little bit of single-storey building there is a linkage between the house and the church, because in the 19th century, when the Comptons had taken over, It was the sort of second, the Comptons came from Minstead in the New Forest, and it was the sort of second house for second sons, who mostly went into the church. And so Paulet Mildmay Compton
Yes.
was vicar here for 50 years or so. And he built that little room there so that he could get from the house to the church without getting his feet wet. And this same Richard Brodribb, who rebuilt the house, clearly had a reason. He was a sort of county worthy. They were all county worthies, the Richard Brodribbs. He clearly had enough money to build a coach house and stable blocks. We think that this is after 1666. As a result of the plague, the village fell in. There was no village left. All the people had died. And so
There's a rather ominous quotation which says that the houses fell into the Lord's hand. We don't know whether the Lord above or the Lord below.
No, it's the Lord below. It's good old feudalism as usual. And so he was able, therefore, to use this space outside the house and build to the south on an existing barn a couple of coach houses. Very beautiful, elegant, late 17th century, fine stone building. And on the north side, he built a virtually matching block, which was the loose boxes, the stables. But what is really interesting about this whole courtyard is that it isn't at 90 degrees, which would make it quite enclosed. The angle from the church and that building is about 100 to 110, and so you get a sense of expansion into the countryside.
And I think it's also important to say that these railings and the piers with the eagles are all decorations in the 18th century, as are the balustrades in the front of the house.
And also Historic England has said that the ha-ha, you know what a ha-ha is, it's a ditch that stops the cattle coming in, has said that the ha-ha is 17th century. Actually, it was put in by John's father in 1956 or so.
That was a jolly good idea too.
Very good idea, excellent.
And the two eagles are saying to each other, "Are you going to go first?" So we rather enjoy the spontaneity of the eagles.
They're after Le Nôtre, who did a lot of work at Versailles. We've got through to the 18th century where we've got, this is 16th and 17th. There's a lovely balustrade along the top here, which is 18th century. And we've got the railings and the eagles, again, 18th century. And if we go round to the north facade, it was remodelled in classical style by yet another Richard Brodribb, who was even more of a county worthy than the other ones. And it was done by the bastard brothers of Blandford, the famous contractors of the time.
After the fire in Blandford Forum,
yeah.
Yes.
So that the house stayed in the same family, Bretts, Morgans, Brodritts, Comptons, until it was sold in 1919 and bought by the wonderful Mrs. Ethel Laboscher, who actually was Ethel Monroe, and whose brother, incidentally, was the guy who founded the walks up the Munros in Scotland.
Yes.
And she turned the place into a building site, a complete building site. There's no bits of the original roof and roof timbers left. It's all 1920s. And she says she redid the roof, and then she put in a rather fine memorial garden, and in memory of her husband.
I was going to say, her husband, who died during the war, and was from a Dutch banking family.
Yeah, the Labochers are kind of...
And they've got a signature up in the window there, the coat of arms of the Labochers, with a stork and the flag.
No, and then in the little hall here,
and the hall,
there's a coat of arms. And also in one of the bedrooms. I mean, she littered the house with her coats of arms, actually. But she did a fantastic job on this house and clearly rescued it from, I should think, near dereliction.
And then came the Montague.
And then came your father.
The Montague family. My father was rather fed up with politics, especially with Edward Heath and Europe. And he decided to come live down at Mapperton, giving up the old family home at Hinchingbrook, much converted and very large. So he came down, lived here, leaving my mother in London, who never really fancied leaving London or Hinchingbrook, but she came here occasionally afterwards. He was here for up until 1995 when he died, and we overlapped with him and looked after the house as best we could on his behalf. And it has to be said that he did put an orangery in the garden, and he extended the arboretum down into the valley. So he did make his mark on the garden especially.
He did some wonderful planting in the garden. He was wonderful at planting trees, and he planted with a very, very good eye indeed. Marvellous planting.
And then came ourselves. And I think we've enjoyed living here, although it's been quite hard work when you just look at some of the things. We've replaced that whole roof there, for instance. And a lot of work's been done in the house. Mm-hmm. What can we remember? A lot of burst pipes.
Well, basically, anywhere you look, both inside and outside a house of this age, you can reckon that you've redone the gutters, done the downpipes, repainted, changed the radiators, mended the furniture, cleaned the pictures, whatever. It's all maintenance. And sometimes it genuinely is improving things. Most of the time it's just maintaining the status quo.
And I think we've enjoyed inviting the public to come in and help us support the house. After all, that is quite a logical thing to happen. We've made absolutely certain that people know about Mapperton and can come here almost throughout the year.
If you are enjoying this episode, please consider supporting this important part of England's heritage by becoming a patron at mappertonlive.com.
Well, Hinchingbrooke had been a priory from the time of the Cromwells in the 16th century, and then it was dissolved and became a private house, still with the Cromwell family. The first Earl of Sandwich, as he became, moved there as a boy, and 1627, I think, was the year when Hinchingbrooke began as a family home for the Montagues. Well, my father decided that it was too much to keep up a big house. In the 1950s, we were obviously making up for a lot of ground after the war, and some houses stopped at that point, but we did carry on, and we were even selling tickets at the door when I was about 10 years old. So my father was doing his utmost. One thing he did was to move us into a wing to save money, and then he remained in the main house with staff, of course. And my mother, in the end, couldn't bear it. She was having difficulty in the marriage anyway. So, I mean, when he decided finally to sell in 1956, we all took off for London at that point. And so he was looking for a house down in Dorset, where we already had an estate, going back to the time of the 5th Earl of Sandwich, called Hook Court. And my great-uncle lived there up until he died in 1916. But it nevertheless was a very convenient alternative. And my father knew the house here at Mapperton. He would have visited several times already. And so when the owner died, he was ready to move in with the rather larger collection, in spite of the sales that there were around the house. There was a big family sale at Hinchingbrooke, but he wasn't such a skilled curator as my grandfather, his father. But my grandfather was still alive. He might have given him a bit of advice, but it was chiefly his sisters, who were called Faith and Elizabeth, or Betty. And they were both living in Dorset already, so it was easier for them to drop in and give him a hand and advise where something should be hung. I think it's rather fascinating to explore the things that are more important, but not necessarily connected with Montagues. You know, there might be something that's been collected along the way, which is in itself, you know, inherently interesting. And one example is the Renaissance table in the hall, which is where I am now. And this is a very distinguished piece of furniture. Caroline knows a lot more about furniture, but this is one which I've always admired, and it has figureheads, it has carvings, decorations, takes you back, and it's nothing to do with the Montagues except they collected it.
This picture here of the great progenitor, Lord Montague of Boughton, his hands are so often look like dead fish, but I've always put a plant in front so that you never quite see the hands. And in fact, that plant's a bit small. I need to put a really large plant in there so you can't see his hands at all.